It was arguably in this Franciscan-style suborder that the Brotherhood's early missionary striving found its purest embodiment. The IHSM's mission was articulated more fully in Uniting All Faiths, the Order's 1973 promotional booklet. The booklet stated that the primary purpose of the suborder was to bring the physical vehicle back to its primordial state, thus preparing the sisters for a healing ministry. As the students learned to exemplify the purity of Mary through an immaculate life and mind, all women would be elevated to their proper place in the divine economy. Novices in the suborder would be sent to the Mary House in Chicago, where they would receive an intensive 6-week training in first aid, finances, counseling, healing, and working with children. After this instruction, the sisters would be sent out in pairs to set up mission stations, teach classes, and perform service work in various charity organizations. The IHSMs wore blue-green robes upon which the suborder's insignia was sewn. The insignia consisted of a red rose through the center of which a downward-thrusting sword was embroidered. One other development in the year and a half before Blyton's death appears to have been related to the movement's new focus on Mary. This development began at a Sunday service in San Francisco on December 30th, 1972. Just as Blyton was elevating the chalice to perform the transmutation, he appeared to be struck by some force that left him profoundly disoriented. Pulling himself together, he lowered the chalice, turned around, and announced, "I have been told to say the Grail is with us." This event sparked a great deal of speculation in San Francisco as to its possible significance. Blyton asked several priests to meditate on the meaning of the Grail and directed his secretary to begin research on the medieval Grail legends. In a 1973 HOOM article based on the research, knighthood and chivalry were described as a linking together of the pagan ideals of strength and courage with the sentiments of kindliness, self-sacrifice, and universal brotherhood that were the Virgin Mary's legacy to Christendom. The chivalric ideal of womanhood, the piece concluded, had empowered women to step beyond the domestic and religious spheres into the secular sphere, where their feminine graces would refine the outer social fabric. Messages were also received directing that the Grail chalice, the cup Blyton had been elevating when he announced the Grail's presence, be used every seventh day for communion, and that the presence of the 4 great archangels and the Trinity be invoked during these services. The Grail itself was proclaimed to be the source of conscience for the direction of the order. Soon, a small chapel to house the Grail chalice was under construction next to Blyton's sleeping quarters, and the master teachers were being taught to make use of the sacred implement in healing work. In time, it would become standard practice for the Brotherhood's priests to spend nightly vigils in the Grail Chapel, prayerfully awaiting revelation concerning the group's direction. Blyton's intimation that the Holy Grail of Arthurian legend had in some mysterious manner been vouchsafed to the order deftly assimilated the medieval traditions about a secret band of Grail Knights that appeared throughout history to guide and heal mankind, with the group's established identity as an elite army of light under the aegis of the Great White Brotherhood. Several ex-members reported that after this appropriation of the Grail mythos, the movement experienced a general upliftment nationwide. In the words of one priest, at the time that happened, the energy of the order actually did raise. It was like functioning from a new level. I think there was a greater realization of what the order was, of the purpose of the order. Thus the episode stands as a testament to Blyton's skill in appropriating ancient mythic complexes and using them to renew a sense of zeal and commitment in his followers. Another organizational development during 1973 to 1974 was the institution of a new rank in the group's hierarchy, the brother and sister teachers. These members were priests who had been designated by the host, the White Brotherhood, as trainees for ordination into mastery. They were called brother or sister teachers simply to distinguish them from fully functioning master teachers. This additional rank was made necessary by the defection of 5 master teachers between 1969 and 1973, which had left 5 apostolates without leadership leaders. Ostensibly, to address this problem, Blyton was given the names of 12 priests in Revelation, whom he was to place under the direct supervision of a master teacher. After 3 months of advanced training, the brother or sister teachers were to be sent out to administer an apostleship for 6 months. If they discharged their duties in a responsible manner, the trainees would become part of the order's privy council and await the White Brotherhood's selection of them for full mastery. The Privy Council of November 26, 1973, was the first to include a full contingent of these apprentice master teachers. They wore golden robes with white waist cords, and their crosses hung from gold ribbons, in contrast to the purple ribbons used by master teachers. To celebrate their elevation to the Privy Council, the brother and sister teachers were feted with a gala dinner complete with waiters, candles, champagne, steak, and lobster. In time, the members of this new rank would come to enjoy the emerging aristocratic lifestyle of the master teachers. The 12 persons chosen for this training had all shown strong leadership qualities in the past. Their ranks included Josephine and Richard Schaefer, who now oversaw the Christian Community Bureau, James Harris, the head of the discipleship movement, Stephen Bauman, an educational psychologist who would become a foreign missions leader, Joseph Brown, Barbara France, and Herbert Woodhead, the corporation president. Woodhead and his wife Ruth were middle-aged Air Force retirees whose backgrounds included affiliations with the Baptist, Methodist, Congregational, Presbyterian, and Unity churches. After marriage and the birth of their 2 sons, the couple had lived at a base in Greece before settling in Richmond, Virginia. At about this time, Ruth Woodhead began to have spiritual experiences that her local Presbyterian pastor could not explain. She left the church and studied for a time with a Taoist teacher and with the Self-Realization Fellowship. The couple's son Peter, who had struggled with drug addiction as a youth, met and joined the order in Alabama in 1971. After seeing how much their son had changed, the elder Woodheads and their younger son Michael decided to move to San Francisco and to study directly under Blyton. They sold their house in Richmond and donated all their savings to the Brotherhood. By October of 1972, both of the elder Woodheads had been ordained as priests, and Herbert Woodhead had become the movement's chief real estate purchaser. Between 1973 and 1974, the number of order marriages slowly increased, although the partners were still usually priests. These marriages, like the one celebrated in January 1973 between Bernadette Gay and Michael Maciel, became festive occasions in the movement. In large centers such as Chicago and San Francisco, the entire Brotherhood community gathered for the ceremony and the wedding feast afterward. The more these feasts became publicized, the more the order's life-vowed membership, many of whom had reached their mid-20s, found marriage to be an attractive option. To address the mounting pressure for a change in marital policies, the Esoteric Council convened in March 1973 to reconsider the regulations in this area. On March 16th, they issued their new rulings. The first of these stipulated that after their required period of separation for spiritual attainment, husbands and wives should be reunited, even if one of the pair had failed to reach the same spiritual level as the other. With the group's strong emphasis on initiatory attainment, questions had sometimes arisen as to the viability of old marriages once one partner had undergone a putative initiatory transformation. This first new rule was designed to address these questions and to promote marital fidelity at the same time. The second regulation declared that in the case of a child being conceived through marital infidelity, the spiritual tie with the marriage partner was to be considered broken, leaving each partner free to remarry. This rule was intended to cover situations in which married couples who had entered the order had subsequently conceived children with other partners during their long separations. These persons, after disciplinary sanctions, were now given permission to remarry. remarry. The third rule stipulated that in cases where one partner in a marriage had left the order and had not been reconciled with the esoteric council for a period of 4 years, the council, at its own discretion, could dissolve the former marriage and free the remaining partner to remarry. This regulation was designed to aid members whose spouses had left the movement and who wished to remarry within the Brotherhood. The council also declared that marriages between master teachers could never be dissolved, since the teachers were Christ's apostles and served God before all things. The last of the new regulations stated that no order member could be married before reaching the age of reason, 28, and that the children of any broken order marriage would be taken care of by the order and raised to the glory of God. The former of these rules was a means of dissuading younger members from seriously considering marital relations until they had proven their dedication to the order's work. The latter rule was likely a response to several situations in which marriages had broken up, leaving unresolved questions as to the custody of the couple's children. The pressures for closer contacts between brothers and sisters continued to build throughout 1973. By August, enough accidents had occurred that a further modification became necessary in the movement's previously rigid separation between the sexes. This modification appeared in a revelation received on August 22nd. It said in effect that the Brotherhood's segregation between the sexes had led to more problems than it had resolved. As a result, the time had come for brothers and sisters to live together in the same houses, in decency, in cleanliness, and in a state of spiritual reception. The members would benefit from this association spiritually, as long as there was no side play or interrelations of a physical nature. The long-term consequences of this policy change were unforeseen at the time it was implemented. In retrospect, however, it can be said that the new policy played a decisive role in the group's radical transformation during the 1980s. Because of it, Blyton's earlier fear that this movement would become more a commune of families than a holy order with a planetary mission, if marriages become the norm, would be more than realized in the years that followed his death. The political doldrums that the nation settled into with the unfolding Watergate scandal prompted Blyton to clarify the order's policy on political action. In a general letter sent out in February 1973, the director quoted from the group's bylaws: "We abstain from all political views publicly. You may vote, but do not tell how you vote." What this meant, according to the letter, was that order members would receive no instructions from central headquarters as to how they were to vote. It also meant that the order would hold no assemblies where political views were to be expressed. Blyton stated that it was the personal responsibility of all brothers and priests to hold to a pattern of non-involvement in any political organization. Only in this way would the movement remain above the partisan political frays that continually divided the nation. When asked directly about their personal political views, however, order members could answer that their politics boiled down to the teachings of the Master Jesus Christ and man's right to follow them. Blyton added that in his view the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights were pretty close to what Christ would have advocated. The movement's apolitical stand between 1972 and 1974 did not preclude work on behalf of brothers who were seeking to avoid the draft. In late 1972, Central Headquarters sent informational packets to the local draft boards of all members in draft jeopardy. Each packet contained a letter requesting that the brother in question receive a 2D student minister or a 4D ministerial deferment, depending upon his status at the time. By the end of 1973, the order had received a clergy-exempt deferment for all members under life vows. In one case, however, an order priest, Michael Maciel, had not properly resolved his draft status prior to entering the order and was denied a clergy exemption ruling by his local board. When his case was heard in a district court, the presiding judge decided to make a lesson of Maciel and sentence the married priest to a short prison term at a minimum security facility in Safford, Arizona. Maciel's sentence became a cause célèbre in the Brotherhood, and his prison letters were printed each month in the HOOM. Maciel made the most of his special mission, counseling other inmates, interpreting for Mexican prisoners, and conducting morning communion services. Several of Blyton's directives during this period demonstrate that he was not uninformed concerning national political developments. During the spring of 1972, for instance, as controversy over United States policy in Vietnam was becoming a major issue in the presidential primaries, Blyton sent out a directive to all centers and missionary stations. The directive stated his belief that a nationwide patrol effort by all members of the order would bring peace not only to individuals but also to the world's warring nations. For the entire month of May, therefore, order members would patrol the nation's cities between 8 and 11 p.m. 5 nights a week. The primary objective of these increased patrols, the directive concluded, was to let people know that the light is accessible and that the light of Christ will bring peace. In a parallel development, the Director General, at the height of the Watergate hearings, asked all members to pray nightly that godly principles would be instilled inside the government. Many members later felt that this prayer work had been instrumental in bringing about Richard Nixon's eventual resignation in August 1974. The Brotherhood's ecumenical outreach, judging from letters sent to the HOOM, continued to expand during 1973 and early 1974. For example, order members in Fort Worth wrote an enthusiastic letter detailing their warm reception by a nearby convent of Carmelite nuns. The Carmelites were particularly interested in the movement's special devotion to Mary and in its similar patterns of prayer and fasting. Christian Deschênes, who was guided in a July 1973 revelation to undertake a coast-to-coast walk of the Christos, informed HOOM readers of his frequent encounters with Christian clergy persons and of their interest in the order. In his letter of July 22nd, Deschênes proudly announced that several Catholic priests had expressed their willingness to concelebrate the Mass with him. A letter from St. Petersburg told of the brothers' attendance at a lecture by Kirpal Singh, the founder of the Rouhani Satsang centers. After the lecture, the brothers were granted a personal audience with Singh. The Indian teacher reportedly asked them if they were part of the Jesuit order. When they replied no, he asked, "But where did you get your attainment?" Upon hearing of their training under Blyton, Singh reportedly asked them to stay and share darshan with him. In a related development, the Venerable Samuel Lewis, the Sufi teacher and first director of spiritual education for the order, died before he could name his successor as Murshid of the Sufi order in San Francisco. Sometime later, 50 of Lewis's students suddenly appeared during an evening communion service at 20 Steiner Street. Blyton called the group's leader, Wali Ali, forward, laid hands on his head, and solemnly declared him to be the new head of the Sufi order. The director later claimed that after Lewis's accidental death, Lewis had appeared to him and asked him to pass on his master's mantle to Ali, who had been his closest student. He was simply carrying out his old friend's request. The movement's continuing openness to a wide range of spiritual perspectives was also apparent in the HOOMs of this period. Included in these issues were articles about Meher Baba, Joel Goldsmith, Hermetic philosophy, Chinese Buddhism, pyramidology, the Jews for Jesus movement, and Russian Orthodox monasticism. The publication of these articles and the reports of friendly contacts with other spiritual communities helped to reaffirm in the Brotherhood its ecumenical and non-sectarian identity. In addition, the acknowledgement by recognized teachers of its members' spiritual attainments served to buttress the group's claim to authenticity as a school of initiation. In spite of its friendly relations with other religious communities, communities, however, the early brotherhood can be seen as an implicit critique of the culture and values of late 20th century America. Its Spartan lifestyle and vows of poverty, for example, stood in stark contrast to the culture of consumption that had come to dominate American society during the 1960s and 1970s. As individuals in the surrounding culture came to be more and more governed by the relentless cycle of production and consumption, order members seemingly subverted this domination of objects by abstemious living and a concerted revalorization of their own subjectivity. This revalorization took place through training in meditation, concentration, visualization, and a host of other inner empowerment practices. The movement's communalism and vows of obedience, to cite another example, contradicted the American ethos of rugged individualism by placing substantial limits on its members' options for self-directed action. Moreover, when members took life vows, they committed themselves to a collective enterprise whose stated purpose was essentially altruistic. This commitment to altruistic service, though by no means unique within American communal institutions, was nevertheless incongruent with the pervasive American cult of self-gratification and self-advancement. In a further instance, the Brotherhood's strict regulation of sexuality can be seen as an implied critique of the era's sexual revolution. As traditional sexual taboos collapsed and promiscuity, wife-swapping, bisexuality, and cohabitation outside marriage became commonplace, order members agreed to live in strict segregation by gender, to take temporary vows of celibacy, and to enter heterosexual relationships only with the approval of the collective. Finally, the order's eschewing of partisan politics can be viewed as an attempt to transcend the ideological battles of Cold War America, which in one form or another had become the nation's main animators of intellectual, scientific, and political creativity. The group's related goals for uniting all faiths and promoting universal brotherhood can be understood in the same light, that is, as efforts to move beyond liberal and conservative, hawk and dove, and black and white, beyond all the polarizations that threaten to rend irreparably the fabric of American society. In the Brotherhood's emerging worldview, this social disintegration could be resolved only through an interior transformation of awareness, after which a person could work efficaciously to build understanding between warring factions. Although seen in this way, the Order's value system and lifestyle constituted a stinging critique of American society. The movement's day-to-day existence often fell short of its avowed ideals. As the group prospered economically, some of its more powerful members began to create private fiefdoms in which they could indulge their tastes for material comforts. These indulgences took several forms, including privileged diets, private book and music collections, and greater disbursements of discretionary income. These abuses of power, in turn, were mimicked by rank-and-file members, who often guarded their few personal possessions with unrenunciate fervor. The Order's authoritarian system of internal governance, although effective in controlling egoistic behavior in its members, sometimes degenerated into petty despotism in small centers away from San Francisco. The cost of remaining loyal to the movement in these situations was often any vestige of personal autonomy or initiative. The group's strict regulation of sexuality became especially problematic, given the coeducational nature of the Brotherhood and the counterculture backgrounds of most members. As a result, illicit sexual encounters would become almost routine matters of disciplinary action that in time eroded confidence in the group's hierarchy. Finally, Blyton's valorization of mystical experience and devaluation of intellectual training opened the door to a naive subjectivism in the movement. This subjectivism left the group susceptible to popular religious fashions that were often haphazardly integrated with the main body of the Brotherhood's teachings. Blyton's inability to instill intellectual rigor in his followers also left the Order unequipped to articulate its doctrines in any any systematic or coherent fashion to outsiders. In time, the public embarrassment caused by this lack of intellectual coherence would pressure the order's leaders to adopt a more sharply defined doctrinal position. This position would, ironically, set the movement at variance with most of the religious groups it had once seen as authentic schools of spiritual development. Two events occurred in late 1973 that had a disturbing psychological impact on Blyton and his movement. The first of these was the firebombing of the Order's sister house at 910 Steiner Street. This residence, which was located near the lower Fillmore ghetto, had received several threats from local Black Power activists who were unhappy that the community was attracting even a small number of African American recruits. At a little after 5 a.m. on August 15th, the household awoke to the smell of smoke in the first-floor hallway. An incendiary device had been thrown through the glass of the front door, and fire was spreading quickly throughout the house. The sisters and children occupying the second floor were trapped behind a flaming door and saved from death only because a passerby had immediately called the fire department. Within minutes of their arrival, the firemen had successfully lowered the residents from nearby roofs and brought the fire under control. In all, 21 sisters were treated for smoke inhalation at San Francisco Hospital, and $75,000 worth of damage was sustained by the sister house. Blyton and his followers were deeply shaken by this attack. As his widow wrote, "I suppose we had felt exempt from such things, and it came as something of a shock that our commitment did not render us totally invulnerable." In the wake of the fire, John McCaffrey formed an ecumenical group of local clergy persons who had recently had their properties firebombed. The group sought to develop a strategy for dealing peaceably with the Black Power activists in the neighborhood. One of the clergy persons on the committee was Jim Jones, whose People's Temple had come under particular harassment because of its large African American membership. The second disturbing occurrence from this period was the reception of two death threats against Blyton. The first of these was from a person who had never met the Director General, but who had spent 2 weeks at an order house in Hawaii. The second was from a man who had impersonated a Trappist monk while staying in the Brother House for several months in early 1973. Both men loitered outside the group's headquarters for a period of months and threatened physical harm to any brothers who crossed their paths. In the aftermath of these events, a generalized feeling of persecution and vulnerability began to pervade the movement. Evidence of this persecution could be seen in a Privy Council directive from November 1973, specifying that all communications with the media must have Blyton's explicit approval. Until this directive, the group's local leaders had been given the freedom to deal with the press in the way each saw fit. Although press coverage of the order during 1973 had been overwhelmingly positive, its top leaders now seemed convinced that the Brotherhood had tangible enemies and that it must take strong measures to protect both its members and its public reputation. A trusted co-worker recalled that Blyton seemed unusually troubled about the order's future during early 1974. The director privately confided to him that the movement faced serious obstacles and he was not sure how to surmount them. He was standing in front of the map with the national mission stations on it, and he turned around and looked me straight in the eye and said, "Why isn't it working?" According to this confidant, Blyton was particularly concerned about the priests on mission who were failing to carry out their duties in a responsible manner. Because of these lapses in leadership, the Esoteric Council was neglecting important long-range issues as it responded to small crises around the country. In the words of another advisor, Father Paul had not been able to train responsible second-level and third-level leadership people who could be trusted to manage things properly. So there was just one crisis after another, mismanagement or immature management, oftentimes moral lapses on the part of leadership people, things that came as a result of having had a tremendous explosion in growth and then having to put people into leadership positions on the basis of being strong personalities rather rather than on the basis of being well trained. Perhaps in response to these leadership failures, the training period for priests was lengthened, and the overall number of ordinations dropped sharply during the last months of 1973 and the early months of 1974. Whereas 40 new priests had been ordained between January 1st and September 30th, 1973, only 5 were ordained between October 1st, 1973 and April 1st, 1974. In addition to these management problems, several of the movement's master teachers began to find contradictions in the messages that Blyton was receiving and to question his absolute authority. The elderly teacher's response in these situations was sometimes embarrassingly heavy-handed, leading to a growing disillusionment among his upper echelon of the movement. It is likely that these mini-rebellions took a heavy toll on Blyton, who had become accustomed to his guru-like status among the order's rank-and-file members. Ruth Blyton recalled that on one occasion, shortly before his death, her husband had awoken her and Master Marthelia and asked them to go into the Grail Chapel to pray for him. He had said to her, "You don't know what I'm going through." Throughout 1973, the messages coming through Blyton took on an increasingly millenarian and apocalyptic tone. In one, it was predicted that Christianity would reign in Russia and that communism would be defeated. Another foretold that a New World government would be in place by 1990. A third message declared that a spiritual army was being prepared by Christ to slay the denizens of the deep, who were becoming particularly active in the world. A communication received on December 26 warned that confusion was strengthening throughout the world and that the years ahead would be days of sorrow for many. Each of these developments, the messages emphasized, was a sign that the old age was passing away. In letters sent out during February 1974, Blyton expressed concern that the number of baptisms and the number of people coming into the light had dropped in recent months. He reminded his followers that the transmission of these initiatory rites was the order's main objective, and that they should be fearless in their striving to drive out the Antichrist, because the power of Christ was greater than the power of darkness. These letters also warned of 2 very serious situations that were beginning to manifest in the world as the new heaven and new earth unfolded. The first was an economic breakdown, which in some areas could disrupt transportation and bring about food shortages. In response to this danger, the order would begin to stockpile foodstuffs in its centers throughout the country. This warning was clearly tied to the severe stagflation that had gripped the American economy following the Arab oil embargo of late 1973. The second of these situations, according to the letters, was the failure of the churches to minister to humanity's urgent spiritual needs. As Christian brethren with a revealed mission to prepare the earth and its people for the new age, Blyton declared, the order could not neglect the spiritual outcry of so many in ignorance. In answer to this need, the Director General was instituting a program of freelance missionaries, wherein every available brother or sister would be disseminated throughout the country. The Order's mission centers would be pared down, wherever possible, to 5-person teams, 1 person of which would be from a suborder, and rove freely throughout the region. These emergency measures were to remain in effect for at least 3 years. In the weeks prior to his death on April 11, 1974, Blyton took 2 actions that indicated his growing unease concerning the order's future. The first of these was to gather copies of all of his writings, put them in a container, and direct 2 close associates, Andrew Rossi and David Finkelstein, to bury the container in the desert of eastern California. He joked at the time that this cache of writings would be a kind of time capsule for future civilizations. The second action was to give a copy of the esoteric handbook he had written in 1973, The Book of Alchemy, to his trusted friend Joe Miller of the San Francisco Theosophical Society. Blyton told Miller that the book was a collection of his advanced lessons for master teachers, and that it should be kept in a safe place in case the order disbanded someday. The Director General was especially concerned, Miller recalled, that none of his students appeared ready to step into his place should anything happen to him. The meeting ended with Blyton reflecting, "I don't know how this will work out, Joe. If you can do anything to help them, do it." On Wednesday, April 10th, Blyton announced unexpectedly that he would be spending a few days in seclusion on the Pacific coast of South San Francisco. He took Ruth Blyton and his assistant, Ben Teitelbaum, and set out for the Pacifica Motel, where a suite with kitchen facilities had been rented. After dining with his associates in the motel room, Blyton indicated that he was about to receive a revelation. Unlike previous messages, which had typically been slow in delivery, this one was spoken quite rapidly. Its gist, as Ruth Blyton recounted, was that Paul was moving too fast and that his students were being left behind. After coming out of his entranced state, Blyton and his wife prepared for bed. The elderly man had donned his white robe and was sitting in bed when he rose abruptly and dressed in his black clerical garb. He then began complaining of stomach pains and pacing back and forth in the small living room adjoining the bedroom. According to Ruth Blyton, her husband suddenly fainted and, in falling, hit his head on the edge of a dresser. His stunned wife immediately called to Teitelbaum for help and then notified the master teachers at Central Headquarters, who arrived a short time later. The Assembly Privy Council tried to revive their leader by massaging his feet and other means, but to no avail. Although he remained breathing for another hour, Blyton never regained consciousness. As his widow wrote later, "None of us believed he was really gone. This could never happen to Father Paul, the indomitable teacher." Joe Miller, Blyton's old friend, was called in the morning. When he arrived, he told those who had held vigil through the night to telephone the coroner. He also chided their tears and said that their leader would have wanted them to rejoice. On Good Friday, April 12th, centers around the country were notified of Blyton's passing. At 101 Steiner Street, a sorrowful Ruth Blyton addressed the local Brotherhood community in the chapel. 3 days later, Blyton's obituary appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle. It mentioned the order's early history, including its 1968 incorporation date and the first prayer shrine on Market Street. On the Thursday after Easter, what would have been Blyton's 70th birthday, a simple memorial service was held at the Christian Community Chapel on Cole Street. Masters Phillip and Marthelia McCaffrey were asked to preside. The New Testament reading chosen for the ceremony, 1 Corinthians 2, presented a concise summary of Paul's mission to the fledgling community at Corinth. In the context of the moment, it's clearly intimated that the apostle who had written the words 2,000 years ago was the same person whose death they were now commemorating. "My speech and my preaching were not with enticing words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. For the things which we discuss are not dependent on the knowledge of words and man's wisdom, but on the teachings of the Spirit." After the scripture reading, Marthelia McCaffrey delivered the eulogy. Her words laid out a blueprint for how the movement would cope with the unexpected passing of its beloved teacher. The first dimension of this coping strategy was to initiate the process of Blyton's apotheosis. McCaffrey asserted that she had personally seen Father and that he was now in a state of great joy with his beloved Master Jesus. The true stature of their leader was now becoming apparent. His compassion for every living thing, his tireless service, his strengthening of the teachings of Christ for the new age, and his unfailing devotion and obedience to the Master Jesus. By prayerfully attuning themselves to their deceased leader, who now functioned as a kind of spiritual bridge, members would be taken into the reality of the Heavenly Father. The second dimension of the coping strategy was to affirm Blyton's continuing presence within the movement. The Master Teacher proclaimed, "The work that he has done in forming an order and forming the teachers hasn't stopped. As a matter of fact, from all of the reports that we've gotten, it's increased. Father's presence is so strong in all of the houses because he is with us. Blyton's release from the physical body," she continued, "far from being an occasion for sorrow, was an occasion for joy. He was now easier to contact, easier to follow than ever before. If order members would only reach up for him, they would feel him as closely as they had ever felt him before. The strategy strategy's final dimension was to assert the group's collective commitment to Blyton's initiatory vision, including his doctrine of immortality. The assembly was enjoined to hold sacred their leader's teaching that each person was created in the image and likeness of God, and that the soul's life was everlasting. In his short concluding remarks, McCaffrey's husband, Master Phillip, reassured the mourners of the continuity of the order's spiritual direction. I would like to give you a statement which is from the Holy Order of Mans, because the head of the order is Jesus Christ. There has been no change in this. There is no change of administration in that sense of the word. There is nothing different at all. In her first movement-wide communication printed in the May HOOM, Ruth Blyton repeated that McCaffrey's assertions of administrative continuity and of Blyton's ongoing presence, nothing has really changed at all, except that Father is more free to work individually with each of you, as many have already felt, for we are dedicated to making certain that the order will continue, as God willed that it should, following the way Father has shown and taught so selflessly. Blyton's widow then affirmed her belief based on many clues that her husband had known ahead of time of his coming departure. He had told no one directly in order that there might be no anxiety. Their deceased teacher had also known that his students had matured in the spiritual pathway sufficiently to continue the order's work guided from within. These comments were a clear attempt to reassure those who were troubled by the unexpectedness of Blyton's passing, and by the disconfirming evidence it seemed to present concerning his fabled mastery. The general impact of Blyton's death from May through July was to draw the order closer together. According to one ex-member, a renewed spirit of solidarity and dedication settled over mission stations as the realization set in that each member would have to assume personal responsibility for the movement's continued survival. The group's organizational structures ensured that each center's ruling hierarchy remained intact, and that at least on the local level the daily pattern of life could continue unchanged. At the national level, Ruth Blyton became temporarily the figure all members looked to for final authority. As one student recalled, Mother Ruth was generally loved by order members and greatly respected for her quiet wisdom. Soon after Blyton's transition, the Privy Council met and asked the widow to assume the Director Generalship until a permanent replacement could be found. Blyton's former administrative assistant, Ben Teitelbaum, agreed to assist her. In her new role, the shy, unassuming matron set out monthly messages in the HOOM and presided over esoteric council and board of directors meetings. Her HOOM letters exhorted members to serve the Master in the right spirit of selfless dedication and brotherly love, and to revere the path that her late husband had taught. This quiet attention to daily duties and unswerving loyalty to Father Paul's initiatory system would be the hallmarks of her subsequent leadership in the movement. The Brotherhood's renewed sense of zeal and solidarity was short-lived. By August, several parties had begun to vie for authority in the movement, and the broader implications of the director's absence had become clear. As one respondent commented, it was like seeing something that was real and wonderful disintegrating, just coming unglued. There was a tremendous lack of unity. This observation was echoed by a priest who was stationed in San Francisco at the time. It became more and more obvious as we went on that he, Blyton, had held it all together with his prayer, with his consciousness and knowing. Some members reported a disconcerting attenuation of spiritual power in the movement. The presence left after he left. When I got back to San Francisco, it wasn't there anymore. It was something that had surrounded all the houses in San Francisco. It was a living presence, and when he was gone, it was gone. Compounding this perceived decrease in charismatic presence was the realization that the revelatory basis of the movement's direction was now in jeopardy, since none of the teachers had ever received trance messages. This drying up of prophecy engendered widespread doubts as to the order's future. In addition, the many members for whom Blyton had become a kind of personal guru began experiencing a growing sense of insecurity as they realized that their teacher would no longer be available to them for counseling and direction. These students were now forced to search for a new teacher within the movement from whom they could replicate the guru-chela relationship they had enjoyed with Blyton. Those who refused to take direction from the Brotherhood's other masters quickly left and continued their search for a teacher elsewhere. Part of the disunity that began to plague the movement emerged in the Privy Council. In the words of one former priest, it was evident that she, Ruth Blyton, wasn't going to be able to carry the sense of authority and the organizational elements that Father had. Power struggles for leadership immediately started playing out between the teachers. The first signs of division became visible in Ruth Blyton's uncharacteristically pointed general letter of September 26th. The letter threw down the gauntlet to those who would tamper with the Brotherhood's foundational structures and principles. It was essential, the elderly widow wrote, that all members work to maintain the Order's fundamental purposes. It was particularly crucial not to leave the group's rituals open to easy change by anyone with a personal axe to grind, or with ambitions to have things his way. She enjoined the members to pray that no one with ambition be tempted to foist a secret agenda on the Order now that Blyton was not visibly present. All must keep the Order as Father and the host set it up, so that the Lord Jesus Christ could continue to work through it. Progress and change, the letter concluded, must occur gradually from the Spirit and not from human ideas. According to participants in the Esoteric Council meetings of September and October, the growing divisions in the movement occurred because Blyton had not left specific instructions as to how the Order should be governed after his death. Ruth Blyton, in these members' eyes, was unsuccessful in her attempt to maintain group unity because she distrusted the strong-willed and ambitious master teachers. This distrust led to her eventual refusal to consult with them on crucial decisions and their subsequent alienation from her. In the absence of Blyton's strong charismatic and revelatory leadership, several teachers convinced themselves that their particular viewpoints were God-inspired and put forward a variety of personal plans for the Order's future. Many of these purported revelations from the God Self were seen by others to be patently self-serving. By early fall, the movement's leadership was divided between those who remained loyal to Ruth Blyton and her desire to keep the Order just as her husband had left it, and those who wished to make substantive changes in the organization. In a series of raw and discordant council meetings, later dubbed the Councils of Black October, the teachers attempted to strip Blyton's widow of all but her symbolic position as Mother of the Order, and to elect a new Director General from their own ranks. It was no doubt hoped that the purported revelations that had guided the movement during Blyton's tenure, and which had abruptly stopped at his death, would resume once this vacated position of Master Gnostic had been filled by another white brother. At one point, the animosity and mistrust between the group's leaders became so intense that those priests who were loyal to Ruth Blyton began to fear for her well-being. The priest drove to the Order's new administrative center in Forestville and spirited her away to a guarded location in the San Francisco area. This dramatic scene sent shockwaves among the warring parties that led in short order to a successful attempt at reconciliation. In a more civil series of council meetings in late 1974, a provisional solution to the leadership problem was finally worked out. The agreement acknowledged that no one was truly fit to take over as Blyton's replacement, and that for the immediate future an office would be created called the Steward of the Office of the Director General. The teacher selected to this position would serve as the Order's apostle at central headquarters for 1 year, after which another teacher would take over for the next 1-year period. The first teacher to be appointed steward was Master Raison Anthony Ruiz, who assumed the position in January 1975. Ruiz was a streetwise and street-tough former sculptor who had grown up in a Puerto Rican neighborhood in New York City and had spent time in a state correctional facility as a youth. Ruiz's tenure as steward would be a turbulent, erratic period for the movement. in large part because of his ongoing struggle with the refined and retiring Ruth Blyton, who came to consider him as a wholly unsatisfactory guide for the Brotherhood. As noted previously, the central administration of the order moved its offices to Forestville in Sonoma County in August 1974. The new headquarters, which was purchased for $200,000, had been used as a recreational facility for business executives. The property included log cabins, a swimming pool, a horse farm, several large bunkhouses, and over 20 acres of forest. The ranch, as it came to be known, was bought with two objectives in mind. One, to remove the group's corporate administration from the distracting hubbub of the San Francisco Center, and two, to furnish a retreat center for order members who needed a vacation but did not wish to stay with parents or friends. The eventual mingling of administrative staff with temporary vacationers, however, engendered a party-like atmosphere at the new retreat center that led in turn to moral lapses among the members and residents. Several respondents reported widespread drug use, sexual promiscuity, and drunkenness at the ranch during 1975, all of which culminated in a coup attempt by Master Marion Carter and James Harris, the corporation's president, who declared themselves to be reincarnations of Queen Guinevere and King Arthur, sent to restore integrity and direction to the order's time of need. When the priests and teachers at the ranch refused to come before them one by one to be accepted into the true order of which they were now the heads, Harris announced that the Grail had left the Brotherhood, and with it the spirit of the Holy Order of Mans. The jilted royal pair were then not so politely escorted from the ranch property, put on a bus, and forced to relinquish their positions within the movement. Notwithstanding the disarray at central headquarters during 1974 and 1975, the order continued to grow and prosper outside California. This was largely due to the fact that the conflicts within the Privy Council did not become common knowledge in the field until much later, although a bleak mention of trials and tribulations within the movement did appear in the HOOMs of 1974 and 1975. In terms of overall membership, the Brotherhood grew from 517 vowed members in 1973 to 700 by September 1975. The lay discipleship movement reported over 500 active members in early 1975 and an enlistment rate of 40 recruits per month. New Christian communities were being formed in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, while international mission stations were being established in Vancouver, Montreal, Cologne, West Germany, and Tokyo. The IHSM moved to a larger mother house in St. Louis, where its members set up an emergency shelter for women and children, and the BBHL moved to a new Central Abbey in Detroit, where its brothers worked with local black youth ministries. The total number of training centers and mission stations increased to 63 during this period. The freelance program that had begun under Blyton in early 1974 became the movement's elite corps of missionaries during the remainder of 1974 and 1975. By July 1974, over 28 suborder members had been assigned to visit 70 cities, virtually all of them east of the Mississippi. After their training at the BBHL Abbey or the IHSM Mother House, these nomadic brothers and sisters traveled throughout a particular region of the country, teaching Bible and esoteric Christianity classes, walking street patrols, volunteering in hospitals and prisons, and helping build Christian communities. In a general letter to the Brotherhood, dated July 22, 1974, Ben Teitelbaum discussed the purpose of the Freelancers program. The program had been instituted, he began, to bring the gospel to cities that had never been reached by order missionaries. A second purpose had been to provide on-the-ground experience for new brothers and sisters, something that had always been viewed as an essential part of student training. Each team of missionaries had been given an assignment of 3 or 4 cities wherein they would work over a 1-year period. One of the outstanding features of the program was that the missionaries were expected to provide for their material needs without working full-time and without receiving any support for the order. This gave students an opportunity to put their tools to full use, to pray or not eat, in Teitelbaum's words. The HOOMs of this period are filled with letters from these roving missionaries detailing their spiritual adventures. In one report, a Brown brother described his mission in Youngstown, Ohio. After some tense interactions with pimps and pushers who suspected him of being a narc, the missionary was given free room and board at a drug rehabilitation center in return for his counseling services. A freelance IHSM team staying in New Bedford, Massachusetts, wrote letters describing their nightly street missions and their work in prisons and hospitals. The sisters reported that they were often given temporary accommodations in the convents of Roman Catholic religious orders in the area. Several other letters mentioned the interest shown by Catholic nuns and priests in the Brotherhood's teachings. In at least one reported case, a middle-aged Benedictine nun had been brought into illumination by an order priest. The movement's recruitment efforts took a new direction during this period with the establishment of youth hostels in Albuquerque, Denver, and San Francisco. These shelters for low-budget travelers were viewed as an unobtrusive way to initiate contact with unrooted youths, especially those from Europe, and were projected to be the conduit through which an influx of people to the order would take place. The group also established its first service center during 1975 in Chicago. The center, which consisted of a thrift store and a recreation room, offered youth programs, counseling services, and evening Bible classes. The movement would in time come to see these service centers as a more effective way of addressing the needs of inner cities than its traditional street patrols. The Brotherhood's relations with the public during 1974 and 1975 continued to be generally cordial, particularly with regard to its charity work. The Chicago Superintendent of Police publicly thanked the Order's sisters for their emergency assistance during a Calumet City gas leak in 1974, and the Raleigh, North Carolina News and Observer applauded Sister Elizabeth Whittle for her efforts to turn vacant lots across the city into bustling community gardens. In its interactions with the press, the group began to portray itself in a more evangelical Christian light. For instance, in an interview in an Augusta, Maine newspaper, Paul Anderson began by reaffirming the order's primitivist mission to follow the original foundations of the church Jesus Christ started. Moreover, he added, salvation came only by the grace of God through Jesus Christ. A Christian made a conscious decision to make Christ his Lord and follow him. Then the Christian grew in the Holy Spirit, received the light of Christ, and was reborn. Anderson also affirmed that the movement accepted the Trinity, the gospel, spiritual healing, baptism, communion, and confession. He did not, however, elaborate on just how the movement understood these terms and rites. This more evangelical tone to the order's public pronouncements would continue throughout the late 1970s, reaching a peak in the Brotherhood's 1979 promotion of Juan Carlos Ortiz, a Pentecostal minister from Argentina, known for his creation of charismatic cell groups in local congregations. The group's modified self-representation was congruent with the growing nationwide popularity of evangelical Christianity during this period, and with the willingness of public figures like Jimmy Carter, Chuck Colson, Bob Dylan, and Eldridge Cleaver to claim that they had been born again. The only public difficulties the order encountered during the mid-1970s came from the Internal Revenue Service, which attempted to slap the group with a multi-million-dollar penalty for its failure to pay taxes on its members' outside salaries. Because it was a legitimate nonprofit corporation, the order had assumed that these salaries were tax-exempt. The IRS suit was part of a larger action the agency had brought against such NRMs as Shiloh Youth Revival Centers and Bethel Ministries. The suits argued that the portion of these groups' income that was being used to clothe and feed individual members was taxable, since it was not being used in charitable work. After several years of threats and appeals, the dispute was finally resolved amicably. The order was granted a retroactive retroactive grace period on all earnings prior to the ruling, and agreed thenceforth to pay tax on 50% of members' outside salaries. Respondents who were involved in the case believe that the Brotherhood's highly visible service work and Catholic appearance were the factors that saved it from a financially crippling tax court decision. The Shiloh Centers and Bethel Ministries were not so fortunate, however. In their cases, unfavorable rulings led to the group's complete demise. The order maintained its ecumenical, esoteric, and eclectic character during 1975, publishing HOOM articles on the Tantric master Padmasambhava, the Coptic Church of Egypt, the Martinist order, which was intimated to be a kind of proto-holy order of Mans, the life of Quetzalcoatl, and the work of a modern Jesuit astrologer. An HOOM piece by the Sufi Murshid Wali Ali emphasized that each religion approached God with different forms of prayer, codes of conduct, names, and rituals, and that it was the attitude of respect for another's tradition that was of primary importance in attaining world peace and understanding. Another article discussed strategies for avoiding unnecessary conflicts with Southern fundamentalists. The piece advised that members study the religious beliefs of conservative churches and emphasize the points on which they could agree. In their classes, they could teach straight, simple Bible and then inject some truths quite subtly later on. Letters from the field continued to mention friendly contacts between order missionaries and representatives of other religious communities. In one landmark event, the Forestville Methodist Church celebrated Easter sunrise service with the Brotherhood staff at the ranch. As the order expanded its national and international outreach during 1975, members in the field began to notice subtle changes. Particularly in the large centers, daily life became more comfortable and recreational. The quality of meals improved, and members spent more time attending films and watching television. Soft rock music and dancing were permitted in brother houses, and marijuana and alcohol use was not uncommon. Master teachers drove rented sports cars and were waited on hand and foot by novices and students. Life-vowed members were allowed in selected cases to attend vocational schools or universities. One priest who crisscrossed the country several times during 1975 noticed a growing lack of coordination between centers. There seemed to be a little more divergence appearing between how things were run from one center to another. I became concerned about whether we were still holding to the same principles and ideas. Another priest recalled that a laxity of discipline and zeal began to pervade the movement in the year after Blyton's passing. Father Blyton relayed to everyone in the order the immediacy of the need to carry forth the order's mission of spreading the light. The militancy with which he felt this definitely slackened off. There wasn't as much of a feeling of being on the tip of a spearhead that was moving, slicing. It almost gave people a chance to relax, even though things were chaotic, to fall back into the way they used to be. Several ex-members interpreted these changes as part of a larger social shift taking place during the 1970s, from interest in political change and social justice to interest in personal growth and enjoyment. The order version of the culture of narcissism posited by commentators such as Christopher Lasch. A greater fraternization between the sexes also occurred, spurred on by the marriage of a brother and sister from Argentina. This unprecedented event opened for the first time the possibility of conjugal relationships between members who were not priests. Brothers and sisters kept company under the watchful eye of house parents and could petition the regional council for permission to court if the relationship became serious. This permission was usually granted. If the council disapproved of the relationship, however, one or both parties would be transferred abruptly to another region. The increasing fraternization seemed to release a flood of pent-up libido in the movement, leading to occasional accidents and abuses. As one ex-member recounted, at one point Master Reyson Ruiz had to send out a letter to everybody saying that a false teaching was being perpetuated, that sex can be a way of helping helping somebody spiritually. He said this was an extreme fallacy and we did not condone it. Ruiz also had to contend with a summer mini-rebellion initiated by brother and sister teachers who were tired of their subordinate position in relation to the master teachers. During stormy esoteric council meetings, the teachers in white were confronted with their alleged unwillingness to share their authority and to give the brother and sister teachers room for their own growth. In the midst of these conflicts, Ruiz sent out a general letter to the membership, assailing those who were hiding their fears and selfishness behind the veil of supposed needed change. In Ruiz's view, Blyton had left behind a very simple structure with a solid foundation and lots of space to grow, live, attain, and simply be. He had set up ancient, reliable forms for power, force, and energy to move through, and a simple behavioral code that was designed to engender responsibility, consideration, and decency. In a distinctively new cadence, Ruiz concluded that what is so is that you are okay the way you are. What I want to get to is this, that your holy order and you are perfectly, exactly the way you are now, and that all you have to do is what you said you would when you applied. After a great deal of mutual recrimination, a semblance of order was restored, and Masters Phillip and Martellia McCaffrey took over as stewards in early 1976. Ruiz's peculiar phrasing in his general letter was the result of his clandestine participation in Erhard Seminar's training, established in San Francisco. This educational corporation, which combines self-help disciplines derived from Scientology and mind dynamics with Gestalt psychology and Zen meditation, claimed to help its clients transform their abilities to experience living so that their chronic problems would clear up just in the process of life itself. During the 1970s, 1 out of every 9 college-educated young students in the San Francisco Bay Area reportedly took the training. As the research of William Bainbridge has shown, it is not at all uncommon for a teacher in one movement to seek training in a competing movement. In fact, Bainbridge reports the leaders of NRMs cannot resist appropriating new ideas and activities from their competitors. Hardly a modern religion can be named that did not add elements from other sources as it grew. According to former associates, Ruiz was attempting to combine elements of EST's teachings with the Order's Tree of Life lessons. As part of this effort, he and 30 other Order members attended EST seminars in San Francisco and Denver. One ex-brother recounted that many of these members left the movement soon after the seminars. As a result, Master Philip McCaffrey forbade any further participation in such a disruptive training and spearheaded an effort to weed out the EST jargon that had crept into the Brotherhood's internal discourse. But the stance took its toll. Ruiz began to lose favor with the Order hierarchy, and in the late 1970s left the movement to form the Society for Christ's Disciples in Bloomington, Indiana. This spin-off group attempted to embody Blyton's original vision of a New Age school of Christian initiation. Although the society flourished for a time, Ruiz himself died of a cerebral hemorrhage during the early 1980s. The one-year stewardship of Masters Phillip and Martellia McCaffrey was marked by concerted attempts to revise the Tree of Life lessons and to professionalize the movement's ministerial training. It was also a period during which the group initiated a strong push to expand its foreign missions. By the end of 1977, the Brotherhood had established mission stations in Cologne, Amsterdam, Bordeaux, London, Tokyo, Vancouver, Buenos Aires, San Sebastian, Spain, and San Juan, Puerto Rico. Philip McCaffrey's effort to rewrite the Tree of Life lessons was reportedly undertaken at Blyton's own request, in recognition of the fact that many of the lessons were almost incomprehensible because of poor grammar and the haphazard way materials from different sources had been thrown together. As McCaffrey recalled, the lessons were basically notes unrelated to one another. You'd be reading along in one paragraph and you'd go to the next paragraph and it would be a totally different thing. You'd go, how in God's name does this relate? Because he, Blyton, had just cranked these things out on demand to try to have a course to present. He'd never even edited some of them. So you go, well, this is an embarrassment here. Are you going to institutionalize embarrassment? Are you going to say, well, everything we ever wrote, or are you going to begin to edit? Although he was opposed by traditionalists who believed that all of Blyton's writings were sacrosanct the way they were written, McCaffrey completely revised the first and second level Tree of Life lessons and improved significantly the quality of the movement's curriculum. The uneasy status of the truce between Ruth Blyton and the pro-change master teachers could be seen in subtle ways during 1976. Without informing the teachers, for instance, the elderly widow reactivated the charter for the Science of Man Church in Sacramento. This charter had lain dormant since the order's incorporation in July 1968. In addition, a small notice appeared in the HOOM admonishing members to please take especially good care of your old copies of the original bylaws, which contain the sacraments as originally received. Father Paul was most desirous of perpetuating copies of these sacraments. As these become worn, the old bylaws will be reprinted without change, to be kept in centers as a reference work. While it may not be needed in our time, future generations will be most thankful to have access to uncut original versions of the Order's founding directives. A similar notice appeared in a later HOOM issue, directing all priests and life-vowed members to obtain personal copies of Blyton's Book of Revelations. In a general letter sent out in February, Mother Ruth called upon members to reread the Brotherhood's Articles of Incorporation, wherein it had promised the state and the public that it would act and live according to definite principles. She added, rules may come and rules may go in the order, but the Articles of Incorporation must stand and remain as they are, a firm foundation resting on service to God. A portion of the articles was printed with the letter reminding members of their revealed mission under the order of Melchizedek to preserve the ancient Christian wisdom teachings for the coming generations. With the total number of clerical defections having reached 55 by 1976, the Privy Council decided that a more sophisticated and rigorous training was needed for candidates to the priesthood. The McCaffreys took charge of these efforts at professionalization, and under their supervision, preparation for ordination became a classic initiatory ordeal. As one of their students recounted, there were 10 of us, 5 men and 5 women. When we got off the bus in San Francisco, we put our bags in our rooms and went immediately down into the chapel. All 10 of us were in the chapel for a week non-stop, day and night. No talking. There were people we had been with the whole week, and we didn't even know their names. We would file upstairs for meals, sit down at our table, eat the meal in complete silence, and go back downstairs. I don't think all 10 of us made it through that. After the first week, the students assumed responsibility for security vigils at the Brotherhood San Francisco centers, a duty that made it impossible to settle into a regular pattern of sleep. An intensive series of classes was held each day from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., during which Marthelia McCaffrey taught courses on tarot symbolism, illumination, marriage, and family. In the evenings, the trainees were sent out on street mission. We had a map of San Francisco. We blocked it off into areas, and each one of us was responsible for an area. If something happened in that area, if there was a knifing or a car wreck or something in the paper the next morning, the teacher would ask, "Did that happen in your area? Where were you?" Not that we should have been there. He just said, "Account to me for that." The more demanding training of priestly candidates resulted in a generally higher level of clerical functioning in the movement, but a reduced number of actual ordinands, from 28 in 1974 to 11 in 1975 and 1976. In another move toward professionalization, the Privy Council created an intermediate level of initiation between life vows and the priesthood. The first class of these newly designated minister priests began their training in San Francisco under Master Andrew Rossi during late 1975. Rossi's reputed erudition was much in evidence as he took his 40 students through 9 months of Zen-like mental training and classes in Christian theology, homiletics, history, and sacramental philosophy. This more lengthy and professional training of junior clergy also yielded favorable results for the movement. By 1978, each minister ordained from the class was still making positive contributions to the order's work. The original impetus behind the Brotherhood's foreign outreach had been a series of revelations between Blyton received in 1973. The messages directed that as part of the group's mission to create a planetary girdle of light, emissaries be sent to Europe, New Zealand, Central America, South America, and Canada. During winter 1974, Margaret Wishek, Blyton's former secretary, trained a small mission team which included Christiana Voigt, a native German who had met the order at Raphael House in San Francisco, and Stephen Bauman. Bauman and Wishek, after their marriage and ordination as brother and sister teachers, relocated to Cologne in late 1974. By 1976, their mission station had become a training center for 20 vowed brothers and sisters, about half of whom were Europeans. With the McCaffrey strong encouragement, mission stations were set up across Europe in 1976 through 77. The locations chosen included London, Bordeaux, San Sebastian, and Amsterdam. Members also traveled to Prague, Stockholm, and Kisumu, Kenya, to investigate their potential as regional mission centers. In November 1976, the Esoteric Council established an international committee to research the differences in international laws and to act as an advisory board between the foreign mission corporations and the Esoteric Council. By the end of the year, 3 additional stations had been established in San Juan, Buenos Aires, and Tokyo. Like their American counterparts, the foreign missionaries found jobs in youth hostels, hospitals, and schools. They also made friendly contacts with officials from other religious communities, especially priests and nuns from Catholic orders. Letters published in the 1976 HOOMs bear witness to the high hopes these missionaries had for a triumphal worldwide expansion of the order's work. After visiting a Marian shrine in Garabandal, Spain, for example, Stephen Bauman wrote that the town was a vital center of New Age spirituality and that an order priest should establish a mission station there. In time, he added, many would come into illumination at the shrine. A sister in London, in another instance, exulted, "Miracles happen every day as this mission blossoms." Last night we had 6 people come for midnight mass in what must be one of the lowliest chapels in London, but it served to remind us of the first Christmas, and when we came out into the cold night air, a great circle of sky had cleared over the chapel and the Christmas stars were shining bright. Perhaps next Christmas we'll see missionaries riding in from many parts of Europe. Indeed, foreign outreach was a common phenomenon in the ERA's and RM's groups as diverse as the Divine Light Mission, ISKCON, and Rajneesh's The Unification Church, and the Church Universal and Triumphant set up extensive worldwide networks during the 1970s, with Western Europe being the most fruitful mission field in terms of recruitment. The Order's missionary teams, however, with their conservative Catholic appearance and quasi-Christian message, had limited success when competing against the more colorful and exotic Eastern movements. Those with a serious interest in esoteric Christianity could join well-established anthroposophical, Martinist, and Rosicrucian groups. Such organizations had the additional advantage of being European in governance and cultural style at a time when anti-American sentiment was running strong among the continent's youth. Although it appeared in the pages of the HOOM that the movement was spreading rapidly throughout the world during the late 1970s, few of the foreign mission stations were able to attract non-American recruits.